Hello, good morning. Good morning. My name is Chris Karate. I'm Vice President of Communications here at the Washington Post and General Manager of Washington Post Live. Really appreciate you all joining us here for our 9th Annual Cybersecurity Summit. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge today as a really meaningful one for the Washington Post and for the cause of press freedom around the world. 1 year ago this morning, journalist and Washington Post contributing columnist Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The Post has been paying tribute to Jamal throughout this week, and just moments ago, Post publisher Fred Ryan and the Post's owner Jeff Bezos spoke at a memorial for him in Istanbul, just steps from where Jamal was killed. Jamal's courage and his work will not be forgotten. For me, Jamal inevitably brings to mind the importance of a free press. But more broadly, our ability to access information and communicate openly is the lifeblood of our democratic society. So much of our communication is done digitally, right, over texts or emails, on social media platforms. Our digital lives are encoded in data. They're ping-ponging around servers all over the country, on networks throughout the world. Securing these spaces is critical for free expression and for free enterprise. And understanding the threats we're facing is an important first step. But issues of cybersecurity are not always clear-cut. The same technology that keeps classified government information from getting into the wrong hands can be used to shield criminals in the darkest corners of the web. The hacking tools used to track journalists and dissidents are similar to what law enforcement uses to track criminals and terrorists. Today, we're going to try to sort through these issues with experts on the front lines of cybersecurity innovation and governance who are working to keep everything from our elections to our smartphones and emails safe. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our nonprofit sponsor, the Washington Institute, and our supporting sponsor, the University of Virginia. I'd especially like to thank our presenting sponsor, Raytheon, and welcome to the stage John Check, Senior Director of Cyber Protection Solutions at Raytheon. He's going to say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris. Good morning. Thank you to Chris Karate and the Washington Post for convening today's discussion on such an important topic to our national security. I'd also like to thank the University of Virginia, my alma mater, go Hoos, and the Washington Institute for supporting this event alongside Raytheon. The speakers we will hear from today are pioneers and key thought leaders on the front lines of protecting our nation, our businesses, and our lives from cyber threats. Each of these speakers brings a unique perspective on how we can come together as a community to address the challenges we face. And what better time to come together than National Cybersecurity Awareness Month? This year's theme is Own It, Secure It, Protect It. Our goal is to make practicing good cyber hygiene a lifetime campaign and not just something we focus on once a month. I believe cybersecurity truly is a shared responsibility. Not only is our data at stake in this contested environment, so too is our democracy. Over the years, we've seen interference in our elections, critical infrastructure, and throughout the private sector. Today's experts will address 3 key themes: the need for trusted public-private partnerships, the importance of information sharing, and the advanced technology to help combat the threat. The convergence of these topics is where the power truly lies. Together, we make it more difficult for our adversaries to breach our critical infrastructure, erode trust, and impact our safety. Raytheon is proud to be a trusted security provider, providing technical solutions such as cyber as a service that matures the security posture and improves the resiliency of government and commercial organizations. Thank you again. I look forward to a great exchange of ideas this morning.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming this morning. I just want to join in what Chris Karate said at the outset. This is an anniversary that has a lot of meaning for us at the Post. The fact that our publisher, Fred Ryan, and our owner, Jeff Bezos, traveled all the way to Istanbul to speak on behalf my colleague and friend, Jamal Khashoggi, illustrates a commitment that they have made personally, which I think all of us journalists here at the Post feel very grateful for. So I just wanted to share that with you. Today we're going to talk about cybersecurity interference in our 2020 presidential elections, a very innovative new way of trying to deal with that. And we're going to talk with two of the people who are most familiar with these issues. First, former Director of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff. Second, former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. Each knows cyber and these issues and the difficult political and legal background as well as anybody who's served in government. I want to start, gentlemen, with a question that's on everybody's minds this week. It involves the question of interference in our elections, but this is the complaint that's been raised by the still unidentified whistleblower whose complaint is now before the House Intelligence Committee and is subject of an intense national discussion going all the way to the issue of impeachment. Without asking you what you think about whether the president should be impeached, I do want to ask you each the baseline question, whether you as experts in this area find the whistleblower's complaint, which we've now read, urgent and credible. Those are the words that were used. And then second, whether you would think that it ought to be investigated to determine whether it's accurate.
Well, maybe I should start, since it's the intelligence community, and I'm very familiar with the intelligence community Whistleblower Protection Act and the complaints that are submitted with it. I would say that of all the whistleblower complaints that I ever saw during my 6.5 years as DNI, that this one was the best written, best prepared, footnoted, and caveated as appropriately it should be. And the law prescribes that once a whistleblower complaint is submitted, it goes directly to the Intelligence Community Inspector General, which became statutory during my time as DNI, and accordingly acts independently. The Inspector General makes a determination about, is the complaint credible? I don't recall ever having one that was declared to be urgent. And so that was done. The whistleblower complied meticulously with the provisions of the law. And for me, it was one of the most credible, compelling such complaints I've ever seen. Should it be investigated? Absolutely. That's the whole premise of the Whistleblower Protection Act, is that serious, credible complaints of wrongdoing should be accordingly investigated.
Mike, what's your feeling about those same issues? Was it credible, urgent, and should it be investigated?
Well, I can't judge whether it's credible, because I think you have to obviously investigate. You have to determine what the basis of knowledge is. Does the person, were they in a position to know certain things or not know certain things? There are probably going to be other people who would have to be talked to. What I would say is this, though. Obviously, it's a matter of significant concern. Any investigation ought to be dispassionate, fair, thorough, and expeditious. What should not happen is people announcing the result they think they're going to get before the investigation is done, because that impairs the credibility of the whole process.
If I could add just one
Yes.
other point, just to be clear, that the law stipulates a period of 14 days, I believe, where the Inspector General can investigate the allegation that's contained in the complaint. And that was done in this case, where there was, within the time limit of 14 days, a corroboration, at least in the IG's mind, before he forwarded it.
And Jim, let me ask you, because you were in the position that acting DNI Joe McGuire found himself just after taking office. He made a decision when he received the complaint from his Inspector General to go to the White House and the White House counsel, and then to the Justice Department, the Office of Legal Counsel, both institutions, in a sense, part of the whistleblower's complaint. Do you think that was appropriate?
Well, he is in a tough place. Here he'd been acting Director of National Intelligence for about 6 weeks, and this arrives on his doorstep. So I think the way I've answered this, I've been asked, this is beginning to be an FAQ, frequently asked question, and the way I've responded in the past is I think institutionally Joe did the right thing. The problem, of course, by consulting with the DOJ and the White House, and he had a genuine concern about violating executive privilege, or he doesn't have the authority to waive executive privilege. Now, you can argue that the cows come home. Well, was that the right thing to do where he's consulting with an element of the government that's implicated in the complaint? And that's a judgment call that he made. If it were me, I honestly don't know what I would have done. I trust what I would have had is a very extensive and deep conversation with my general counsel about the pros and cons of doing that. And I'm sure Joe did the same thing.
Mike, I want to ask you about a question that's becoming more and more central now, and that is, how can Congress compel testimony, either through subpoenaed witnesses or depositions, other documents, in an investigation that it deems essential, but where administration officials are withholding that information? What happens next?
You know, typically what's happened in the past, particularly when you get a subpoena, but even if Congress wants you to testify, is because they hold the power of the purse through appropriations, generally government officials go along with it because the sanction they face is the money gets cut off. I guess if you're going to be technical about it, what would happen is a subpoena would issue. If someone failed to appear, they would then go to court. The Congress would go to court. They would get a court order mandating the person to appear. And then if the person still failed to appear, they would in theory be held in contempt of court. The other possibility is someone could appear and decline to answer certain questions on the ground that they are privileged. That gets you into some tricky legal issues about whether Congress has the direct ability to impose contempt or whether Congress has to go to court. As with most things in the American legal system, you usually wind up with a potentially extended litigation because you're dealing with unprecedented issues, and that means everybody is going to wind up being careful about how they deal with them.
And would you guess, based on your experience, that this issue is going to end up in the Supreme Court before it's done?
It's quite possible. Obviously, everybody remembers back in the early 70s with the Nixon case. But you know, the court, given its schedule, only has a certain amount of bandwidth, and in some ways, by the time it gets up to the Supreme Court, you're talking about months having gone by. So there may be a tension between the tempo of these investigations and the tempo of the court system. But again, it's a little hard to speculate because we haven't yet seen a concrete dispute that emerges that is ripe for court.
So I want to turn now to our main subject of political interference going forward in the 2020 elections. And I want to invite our audience here and also watching this on live stream. If you have questions, you can send them to me, right to this little iPad. It's hashtag #postlive. And I, in theory, will see them here, and I'll try to look and ask you any questions. But let me ask Jim first, and then Mike, to give us a sense as we head toward 2020 of how well prepared you think we are to protect our elections from the kind of interference that we've seen now powerfully in 2016 and 2018 too.
Well, having happily left the government, I still don't know. It's my impression that a lot has been done, certainly among the key federal agencies, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, National Security Agency, all those that are stakeholders and can help this. So I think a lot has been done over the situation where we were in 2016. But you got to remember, You know, our voting apparatus is very decentralized. It's done at the state and local level, not at the federal level. I was really taken aback during the 2016 and what we were seeing the Russians doing when Jay Johnson, then Secretary of Homeland Security, reached out to voting officials, voting election commissions and this sort of thing at the state level and got a lot of pushback. You know, we don't want the feds messing with this sort of thing. So I think, but having said all that, I am confident that a lot has been done to make it better. If I may, David, just make a point here, which whenever this topic comes up, securing the voting apparatus, voting machines, computation of votes, the transmission of votes and all that, that's hugely important. But that's, to me, at least, is one bin of the problem. The other bin is what I might call, for lack of a better term, intellectual security. Meaning, how do you get people to question what they see, read, and hear on the internet? And this is where the Russians exploited us, exploited our divisiveness by using social media. So that part of the problem, I'm not sure about.
Mike, let me ask you the same thing of how vulnerable you think we are heading into 2020, whether the resistance that Jim describes to federal help to state and local governments, whether that's changing. And then also maybe you'd comment on the broader question that Jim raises about the way in which our information space as a whole now has been, it looks like, contaminated.
So first of all, I agree with Jim. I think that the federal government has been much more active, and I think the states have been much more willing to accept help. I think you'll hear more in some of the later panels about that. I also agree that actually the machines themselves, in some ways, are the least vulnerable because A, they're decentralized, and B, they are normally not hooked up to the internet except very, very briefly. So to tamper with them, you'd have to get physical access. Where I think we have greater challenges are the registration databases, the tabulation databases, and all of the infrastructure around voting, which includes, is the power working? Is transportation working? Can people get to the polls? And these issues require not just preparing to raise your level of cybersecurity against hacking, but it also means resilience. If there is something that makes it difficult to vote on election day, either the database goes down and therefore you can't verify who's entitled to vote, or the trains stop running because of a cyber attack, is there a plan for what do you do next? And that's the essence of resiliency. You've got to have thought through that in advance. You have to make sure you know what the plan is, that you have the authorities, and you have the capabilities. And I think that's an area we ought to look at. On what Jim called the second bin, which is disinformation, I think this is a challenge that's broader than the election itself. Obviously, one of the approaches that the Russians and frankly the Chinese also take to geopolitical conflict is the information space, what they used to call active measures. And the idea here is if you can disrupt the unity of effort of the United States or Europe or other democratic countries, then basically you win without firing a shot because people don't trust each other and they don't trust institutions. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 10 years. In fact, it goes back decades. What has changed most recently is social media and the ability to manipulate that to drive very carefully tailored messages to particular individuals. And that's an area where I think we're still trying to implement standards and approaches that would mitigate the effect of that. And job number one is to get people to be critical in their thinking when they see a story and not simply to accept it as true because, quote, it's on the internet.
So just going to this point that Jim and you both now have discussed, the more that we talk about the insecurity of our election systems, in a sense, the more people have it in their mind that there's something wrong here.
Yeah.
A friend who runs cybersecurity for one of the big social media companies said to me recently, What the Russians really are doing is weaponizing uncertainty. That the very fact that you're uncertain whether these systems may be attacked leads to less faith in the outcome. I just want to ask you, I think it's one of the hardest questions there is there any way to reduce that weaponized uncertainty that you can think of that's appropriate for a democratic government? Jim? Mike?
Well, I would say this. I mean, one of the points that's been made repeatedly is you need to have a verifiable, auditable system for actually getting voting. And whether it's a paper ballot or there are various kinds of tools that are now being developed that would encrypt a copy of the ballot, the ability to assure people that if there were a dispute, it might take a little bit of time, but you could go back and you could actually manually count. I think that's an important confidence building measure.
So, any thoughts, Jim?
Well, I don't have any silver bullet suggestion here other than imploring people to think critically, try to corroborate the information they're absorbing, pick and choose your sources, that sort of thing. I've often fantasized about some sort of national fact checker that unassociated with the government, perhaps. I don't know quite how you'd constitute this, that the fact checker would be seen as uniformly and universally credible, but some body like that could verify or refute what is being said out there particularly on social media.
It's tricky. We don't want a single authority telling us what's true and what isn't.
Yeah.
That sounds like Big Brother, but
George
there's
Orwell.
got to be a solution. So I want to get to something that's really encouraging that you're both involved in. And it's a creative effort to deal with this problem and draw the public in. It's called Cyberdome. And maybe I could ask each of you just to explain the basic idea of this, what sorts of services Cyberdome will offer to candidates around the country in 2020 and hopefully for many years to come. Jim, why don't you start that off?
Well, I was approached by this group, which is a group of citizens, public-spirited, public-minded citizens who have aligned themselves with cybersecurity experts and are put together an organization which is designed to, on a bipartisan basis, support and assist campaigns, and particularly the two national committees, to secure themselves. It's not a government thing, and they're seeking funding outside the government. And Mike and I have both approached about it and are serving on their board of advisors. Mike?
Yeah, the idea here is a nonprofit organization that will offer free of charge to campaigns cybersecurity advice. Now, we've had campaigns hacked, for years. I mean, I remember back in 2008, campaigns were hacked. What was different in 2016 is what they call doxing. Not only were the campaigns hacked by foreigners in order to see what the campaign was thinking about from a policy standpoint, but actually some of the content was disseminated by the Russians and put out there in the run-up to the 2016 election in a way, again, to try to unnerve and demoralize the Democratic Party and supporters. So that, I think, took the weaponization to a new level. And part of what we're trying to do is get the campaigns to raise their game when it comes to protecting against these kinds of intrusions, which can then be, as has been said, weaponized against them.
So I urge people to take a look at what this Cyberdome is proposing. It's a creative idea. It's not the government doing it, but private citizens in a way that should make it easier for people to draw on help. And as we think about how we're going to protect our democracy, which turns out to be more fragile than we realized, this is a pretty good idea, and I'm really pleased to have these two people who are associated with it here with us. I want to ask another question that lurks under the surface of our national debate now, and it's a hard one. But there are a lot of people out there it's clear, who think that there's something that they call the deep state. And they think of probably of people like the two of you, experienced national security, no criticism intended, but they think of experienced national security officials, people like Jim Clapper, who served, if I remember, over 50 years as an intelligence officer one way or another. They think about Mike Chertoff, who's been a U.S. attorney, who's served in various agencies, who's seen every part of our government. And they worry that you've got a kind of hidden hand on the nation's steering wheel. That's surfaced in the whistleblower complaint. People say, what the heck's this CIA guy doing, seconded to the NSC staff investigating the president? So I think it'd be really interesting for people if each of you would just respond from this long experience you've had to this argument that's out there in America, and what is it, Jim, that you'd want to say?
Well, I never heard of the term deep state. Maybe I was in, ignorant bliss or something, but I never heard of that until the campaign and afterwards. There is, allegedly, this is a conspiracy of career government public servants who somehow organize themselves into a conspiracy to undermine or overthrow the president, which on its face is ridiculous. The intelligence community, it's almost holy writ, truth to power, and under whatever difficult circumstances that may be, even if the power ignores the truth, they still have to keep telling it. And my experience has been that, sure, people in the intelligence community, they're citizens like everybody else. They have their political views, but they, again, my observation has been consistently, they park those political preferences at the door before they walk in to the office. So now, unfortunately, this recent whistleblower complaint coming from a member of the intelligence community just fuels that conspiratorial fire that there is such a thing as the deep state.
So deep state is a concept that really comes out of an entirely different context. It has to do with countries where the military is so powerful they also control a lot of the industrial base. If you look at, for example, the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, they actually, in addition to having military capability, they actually control industry. We don't have any of that here. As Jim knows, our military is completely under civilian control, and they stay in their lane. Likewise, the intelligence community is very, very carefully hedged with a lot of rules, and we have courts that supervise almost everything. And if you look at some of the history, for example, of surveillance programs and the controversy that's arisen about those have always occurred because somebody was uncomfortable with the decision being made, and then it got to court perhaps, or Congress changed the rule. So we are kind of the opposite of a deep state. Now, I understand Americans traditionally have had a certain suspicion of government, but that's not so much the question of the civil service as I think it is more generally a question of not having government overstep its role with the private sector. And our solution in our Constitution is we break the government into three parts, and we also have federalism. What people miss sometimes is much of the real power is at the state level in terms of the police and the enforcement mechanisms. And that's one of the things that guarantees that our government cannot overstep or really commit misconduct.
Final question, again, one I think every member of this audience probably would want me to ask you. What's the damage to our national security agencies, to the people of the CIA, other intel agencies, the FBI that you work with closely, Mike, of this period in which you have the president calling the whistleblower, CIA officer, a spy and accusing him of treason? What damage does that do to the people who work for these agencies and also to the partners we have around the world who are our essential liaison?
Well, obviously it's not good. It's not a good thing, and I think it affects a lot of people in the intelligence community. But I have to say, it's a dangerous thing to try to characterize, again, another FAQ, what's the morale of the intelligence community? Well, the intelligence community is a large, complex, globally dispersed enterprise, and there are thousands of people in the intelligence community that aren't affected by this stuff at all. So if you're at Mission Ground Station someplace, you're in Denver or Menwith Hill or Pine Gap, or you're in Embassy X someplace as an intelligence officer, you're just there doing your job, and you're just not affected by this. So the specific elements that are really directly affected and within the intelligence community are, of course, my old office, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, obviously the agency, CIA, and the FBI. It does have effect on them, but there are vast parts of the intelligence community that just aren't directly affected. Now, just because they are a part of the intelligence community and are getting pretty regular bad-mouthing, that's not good for morale. And it isn't good as well for our intelligence partners who share with us in good faith information that they believe is germane to our national security.
Mike?
I guess I'd say two things. My observation is that by and large in the agencies, when there are ups and downs and controversies, people still go about their business professionally, and the vast majority are dedicated to their work, and whether things are uncomfortable or not, it's not going to change the mission. The other thing I will say is, generally, and I think Jim will attest to this, our relations with our good partners overseas at an operational level have generally been able to resist the vicissitudes of politics. Even when the politicians are at each other's throats, the professionals, particularly those in the security space, know how to work together and know how to trust each other. So this will pass, but I would leave you with this thought. I happen to be chairman of the board of Freedom House, which was set up, over 50 years ago to promote freedom around the world. People look to the U.S. as a beacon for the values of democracy and freedom and the rule of law. And when we stand for that, not only do we earn friends, but we actually earn admirers. And I remember meeting people who, when I was in office, in Central and Eastern Europe, who had been high school students during the Cold War and under the boot of the Soviet Union. And they said to me when I met them many years later, the fact that Americans like Ronald Reagan spoke up for freedom, tear down this wall, inspired us to keep strong and to keep struggling for freedom. And that is one of the most powerful weapons we have, and it would be a shame to lose it.
So we've had two of the very best people in national security to kick off our discussion this morning of cybersecurity. Please join me in thanking both of them.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Marks. I am a cybersecurity reporter for the Washington Post. I write the Cybersecurity 202 newsletter, and I'm here with Jeanette Manfra, who is the Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Department of Homeland Security. And we're here to talk, at least partly, about ransomware, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. It's when hackers not only steal your computer files, they lock them up and won't release them until you pay a ransom in Bitcoin. And this has just been a huge problem that has hit cities, including Baltimore and Atlanta, some major industrial players, just small towns, police stations across the United States. What's DHS and the government doing about it?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, I'm from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which was established by Congress close to a year ago to be the federal government's central point for leading cybersecurity and physical infrastructure security, and working with our partners in the private sector and state and locals. And so first, also, if I may, today is the second day of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. For those of you who are not aware, you are now aware. And so The recent sort of spate of ransomware attacks really highlights the theme that we've decided to focus on, which is about accountability. And both as an individual, we're all consumers, we're all employees of an organization. Some of us run organizations. And so how do we think about how we own IT, how we secure it, and how do we protect it? And importantly, we're also very much focused on those organizations who don't have the hundreds of millions of dollars of resources to do all of these things. Oftentimes in the cybersecurity circles, we talk about very advanced, sophisticated, sexy concepts. And the reality is, as the ransomware attacks have shown, is a willingness to attack the most vulnerable organizations. People who are willing to stop schools from functioning, hospitals from functioning, municipalities. That takes a certain sort of low kind of criminal to do that, and so we're really trying to step that up.
And it's also, I mean, in addition to being pretty malicious, are these people relying on, the brightest and best new hacking technology? No,
not at all. Much of the technology that they're using is, sort of commodity malware that, anybody can find and run. There is some more sophisticated stuff, and there's definitely some money in this, and in many cases, the incentives are a bit misaligned when you have, we don't want anybody to pay out because that just encourages future.
Is there ever a situation when they should pay out?
I always say you shouldn't pay out. That being said, I'm not the person in the midst of making that tough decision about what's going on, and I don't fully understand what their risk calculus is. And when you have insurers and others that are going to cover that furthers our problem of that misalignment of incentives. We're trying to focus more on building the resilience and getting the tools. We're going to be releasing very soon a set of cyber essentials, just to place a lot of small, medium businesses, state and locals. They come to us, and while we spend a lot of time focusing on very high-end threats, to the electric sector, to our elections, these things, a lot of people just come and say, where can I start? What do I need to do if I have $5? Where am I putting that $5 towards? And so this month and really beyond with our essentials, we're going to continue to focus on that community.
Is that a new thing for DHS to be focusing on the small and medium businesses, the $5 problems rather than the $5 million problems?
I wouldn't say it's new. We have, we've worked closely with, state and locals, with small and medium-sized businesses. I think what's new is that we're really stepping up and prioritizing our efforts there. Oftentimes, the $5 problem can turn into a $5 million problem, and many times these, just the interconnectedness of everything. Many of these organizations might be public safety, or they might be connected somehow in the supply chain of a larger sort of traditional critical infrastructure. So we don't think we can separate those two communities as much.
One ransomware problem that your office has talked a lot about is the concern about a ransomware attack from Russia, from anyone that targets statewide voter databases in advance of the 2020 election. What are you doing to prevent that?
Well, so first I want to be clear that there's not a specific threat that we're aware of. We're just more sort of logical extension of, as we're seeing this, that is a potential scenario. And there is very basic things to prevent yourself from becoming a victim of ransomware, backing up your systems, updating. And so that's not something the federal government can do for these organizations, nor do I believe it's our role to do that. But what we are doing is publishing more documents. In August, we published a specific ransomware, partnering with associations and state and local leaders, mayors, and others to get that message out, is, thinking about where they're taking that IT money and spending it on preventive measures, and also being able to understand how the federal government can help them in a response scenario.
So big picture, after 2 years of working on this problem since the 2016 election, how confident should Americans be that the 2020 election will not suffer from a compromise by Russia or another hostile actor?
I think I remain very, very confident that the tally of the votes the actual vote count itself will be faithful to what the voter actually put into the machine. And former Secretary Chertoff talked a little bit about the broader sort of architecture. Some of the things that we've really focused on that increases our confidence, and I'm talking just about election infrastructure, not the disinformation, which is separate but related, is in 2016, I saw sort of three main gaps. The first was around visibility. How do federal and state and locals have common visibility on both the threat and how it's actually manifesting in their systems, recognizing that it's not the voting machines that are necessarily connected, but there are systems that are potentially accessible remotely. So we focused a lot on visibility. We spent a lot of time and effort to the point now where we have sensors covering all 50 states. And so that's a huge improvement, and that allows us to take intelligence information or others, either from the federal government or from threat intelligence companies, and quickly sort of ping those sensors. The other thing was ensuring that we had an understanding of a communications protocol. So in 2016, if we had intelligence that somebody was a potential victim or a target, our practice is to go to the owner of that system, and we needed to work out to make sure that the senior official in charge of elections in the state also had visibility. So that was something that we worked out and exercising that. And the last thing was really about how to speak to the public and make sure that the public is getting the facts. And this gets into the disinformation side, and so we did some really unique things, having an exercise with media, so that they would understand how the election day would unfold, making sure that we had quick abilities to run down if somebody's posting on Twitter that a voting machine is behaving erratically, like did happen in 2018. We were able to quickly run it down and realize that nothing was going on there, but we were able to get the facts to the media and the public. So those three areas we continue to focus on, and I think in 2018 we're able to really demonstrate a level of like cross-party, cross-sector, cross-federal, state, local sort of coordination that we weren't able to do in 2016, and we'll continue to expand that, including now the private sector, those who do make the voting machines and the e-poll books, all of those in that coordination leading up to the elections, from the time that first absentee ballot is sort of mailed out all the way till the final vote is tallied.
So, I mean, despite all of the work from DHS and other agencies, hackers at the DEF CON Cybersecurity Conference in Las Vegas looked at a bunch of voting machines that are going to be used in 2020, found vulnerabilities of some sort in all of them. There have been other reports about voting machines that are connecting to the internet when they shouldn't be, possible supply chain issues. Should the American public be concerned about that, and how should they think about those vulnerabilities?
I think it's important to think of these in context. If you need to still work through the report from the DEF CON voting village, but want to make sure that what was done there is how real life sort of happens. So that's an important thing. People who work in cybersecurity, we have a term called defense in depth. You're not sort of dependent on one machine being fully secure all the time and not ever be able to be hacked. You put a lot of things in place, both physical and personnel, as well as technology, and that's really what we're focused on with state and locals, and frankly something that they've done for years. If you even just think about the transparency of the voting process, every time votes are tallied, you have observers from both parties looking at the tally of those votes. And so there's going to be a lot of indicators in place if something wasn't adding up, if it seemed like there was some sort of misalignment of votes. We still remain sort of focused about any actor who seek to spread disinformation or dissuade people from voting, and that's always a concern, and that starts way before Election Day. And so we want to continue to work to make sure that people understand where their authoritative source is, that they can get a provisional ballot, even if something on the registration is not showing that they're eligible to vote.
So you spent a lot of the last 2 years trying to get technology from companies that you don't trust in nations that you don't trust, the Russian antivirus Kaspersky, and the Chinese telecom Huawei off of government systems. Are you working on, and has there been any progress on figuring out a way to get things more secure up front so that you don't have such a long process for the next Kaspersky, the next Huawei?
Well, so that there's a few things there, and it could easily take multi-hours to talk about it. On the kind of the secure by design sort of concept, and thinking about how do we have more secure code, and there's a lot in the software community that is working on this. We're continuing to work on and how do you build more secure coding practices? How is there transparency so a lot of products are a compilation of different sort of code that comes from different places or from different programmers. That may come from different countries. How do you have transparency in that? That's something we'll just have to continue to evolve. Hardware, similar sort of, how do you have that transparency in where your hardware came from? From our perspective, what Kaspersky really taught us is you can't have a very sort of blunt approach and say, well, everything from X country is bad and we can't use that. Our economy just doesn't support that. We've chosen to outsource a lot of things over decades, and we can't just flip that switch. We do want to get to a point where we have more trusted capabilities, but what we really learned is the threat's important, but you can't just sort of hope that you will get to a point where you have this perfect case of a company is a witting agent of a foreign intelligence entity, and there you go, let's just get rid of that. Instead, we're a very risk-based organization. What we kind of came to is sort of three components of thinking about, and we would encourage others, and when you're procuring your IT products and services, is the country's laws of either where the product comes from or where the data is stored is important. And there are certain laws that, regardless of whether a company want to cooperate with their government or not, there are laws in Russia and China and others that would compel that company to provide that data, which was the case in Kaspersky, and we weren't comfortable with that. The second part is the level of access to your system or your data that that IT product or service has. There's a lot of things in IT that don't have a tremendous amount of access to data, and so that's a really important consideration. An antivirus tool has a lot of access, and so that's kind of the second. And then the last thing is really thinking about market penetration. We're coming at it from the U.S. perspective, is if it meets those first two things, but it's just not something that's used in the U.S., that's something to keep an eye on, but it's also not something that we need to sort of overly focus. So when Congress passed the Secure Technology Act last December, which didn't get a ton of press. It happened to be past the day of the shutdown, so other things happening. But it was a really important piece of legislation because it set up the framework by which the government could do what we did in Kaspersky, but it gave us the tools to do it in a more sustainable, enduring fashion. And so that's what's happening right now is we've stood up the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Council. I represent DHS on it, and that'll allow us to have a more systematic and open process for being able to ban these things. The other thing that we learned with Kaspersky is it's important to do it in an unclassified and frankly even public way. The reason we did it publicly was for due process. We wanted to ensure that anybody who would potentially be negatively impacted would be able to have a voice in our decision. And what that resulted in is a lot of people now sort of that don't follow under our directive authority are now following our guidance. And so we're able to impact the larger ecosystem that doesn't necessarily have to follow our orders in any way.
And it looks like we're out of time. Thank you so much, Jeanette, for coming. Thank you, everyone.
No problem. Thank you.
Hello again. My name is Joe Marks. As you probably remember, I write the Cybersecurity 202 newsletter. And I am here with a great private sector panel. We have Google's head of counterespionage, Shane Huntley, director of cybersecurity at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Eva Galperin, and senior researcher at Citizen Lab, John Scott Railton. So it occurred to me as I was thinking about this panel, you guys all look at a vast array of bad people and bad organizations that are targeting the people you work with, from criminals to foreign governments to sometimes people's own governments and intelligence services, and even stalkers, malicious people in your life, stalkers and sometimes partners and exes. So I thought a good way to start was heading down and starting with Shane. Tell me, who are, rather than what are, the main people that are causing problems for the people you're trying to protect online?
Well, in my case, my team really focuses a lot, but not solely, on government-backed threats against our users and against Google. And really what we're seeing these days is that pretty much every government, or most governments, are really engaged in this activity for espionage, for destructive reasons, for disinformation, and it's just growing over time. So internally we have this big map where we color in all the different countries where we actually see a country that we believe is activity we've seen it from. And year over year, there is less and less countries that are white and more countries that are red. And really, you have to be a very small number of countries now are left white on my map. So it really is everyone. It's growing. And I think the sophistication is also growing between the gap is closing between the high end and what was the kind of low end sophistication, that gap is growing. This has become more accessible. So we're seeing more and more players from the Middle East, around the world, able to either build this capability, buy this capability. So day in, day out, we're seeing these users targeted.
Are you still seeing, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea as the biggest threats, or is it really democratizing, to use a very strange word there?
It's always hard to say who's the biggest threat. It really depends who you are, right? So for those four are definitely four of the biggest players in this space. But as I said, it's a lot more broad. If you're somewhere in the Middle East, you might be targeted by your own government specifically. And we equally warn all these users that we have this warning that we put out every month saying, we believe you're the target of government-backed attack. And to give you an idea of the scale, we warned 36,000 users last year that we believed that they were some form of phishing or malware attack that we saw going to them. That's not compromise, that just means they were targeted. So that's sort of the sphere of what we're looking at in my team.
And Eva, from your vantage point, working on digital rights and civil liberties, what are the groups you're most concerned about?
Well, I started out my work really focused on activists, mostly activists outside of the United States, often in North Africa and the Middle East. And over the last decade or so, my work has expanded to get broader and broader and broader. So first we started seeing international activists being targeted. Then we started seeing journalists being targeted, human rights lawyers, scientists. Then in 2016, we experienced a tremendous spike in sort of domestic activists suddenly very interested in their privacy and security, and we've really
Can you expand on that a little bit? Who are the domestic activists?
Oh, we've actually seen a lot of sort of pro-choice organizations that are really concerned about their safety. A lot of civil liberties organizations, a lot of immigrant protection organizations are really concerned, and just immigrants in general, especially including legal immigrants in the United States, are very concerned about their digital privacy and security. And I have, in some ways, an even bigger problem than Shane, in that Shane only needs to secure people's Google accounts.
Only Google?
Just Google.
And all their Android devices, when they are on the website.
Yeah.
About every user on the world. But then, it's an easy job, Eva.
Things are getting contentious already.
This is why you make the big bucks. But the problem that I have is that people come to me and they don't just need to secure the Google environment, but also everything else about their lives and all of their other accounts and things which are not owned by Google, which gets somehow even more stressful, and I have fewer resources with which to do it. And then finally, in the sort of ultimate expansion of my work, I started looking at the victims of domestic abuse. So it turns out that most people who are being spied on in their lives are not being spied on by governments or law enforcement. They are being spied on by stalkers or by exes, or by people with whom they are currently in an abusive relationship. And one of our biggest problems with sort of building a threat model for that is that companies often assume when they're locking down devices that if you have the username and the password and access to somebody's phone, that you have legitimate access to the person's account. And abuse often involves access to all of these things at once. So now we need to completely rethink our threat models, just in case we did not have enough to worry about.
Just to stick on that for a second before we get to John, you made a big address about this at the Kaspersky conference a couple of months ago. Companies including Symantec and McAfee said they're going to start taking this seriously, they're going to start alerting people. Are companies getting better about this, and is it complicated? Because presumably there are some situations where apps like this have legitimate purposes.
Well, to begin with, I wouldn't want Symantec and McAfee to get credit that they don't deserve. Neither of them made a statement. The companies that did make statements were Kaspersky, Lookout, and Malwarebytes. Mm-hmm. So currently we have sort of 3 companies on board. And right now, since we're just now kicking off both Domestic Violence Awareness Month and Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and Halloween, mm-hmm. So just all the spooky things at once. We are really working on getting the antivirus industry all on the same page to take these threats a lot more seriously. Are there legitimate uses for this stuff? It depends on what you mean as a legitimate use and whether or not you're just talking about, like, is it strictly legal? Often this software is violating the law, but the real question is the law where? What jurisdiction are you in? State laws are all different, federal laws are all different, people exist in different countries. The place where I have decided to draw the line is software which is sold commercially and is designed to fool the user into thinking it's not there. So if, for example, you are a parent and you are concerned about where your children are going and you want to see their text messages and you want to know where they are and you want to do some parenting, that's fine as long as you don't feel the need to install this software on their device, which leads them to believe they're not being watched.
So just to clarify, Symantec and McAfee came from a follow-up article I did who said they were working on it. But again, don't want to give them credit that they don't deserve if they have not done anything since then. John, what should we be scared about?
Hey, so it's an interesting question. The Citizen Lab works with these like high-risk groups, kind of similar to what Eva has done. And I feel like our conclusion sounds a lot like what Shane has said, which is wherever we scratch, we find bad stuff. And I kind of think of it as like Neapolitan ice cream. Like the strawberry is like nation state actors who've got like a development pipeline and like good STEM capability. And then your vanilla is like, can't necessarily develop in-house, but can pay for it.
Can you give us examples of that? Can you name names?
Yeah, so like, for example, Citizen Lab has done work for years on the proliferation of what we call like nation-state spyware. So this is stuff made by companies that allege that they sell to governments only for the purposes of like tracking terrorists and child pornographers. In practice, it looks more like an international espionage set of technologies, and they sell to countries like Saudi Arabia and Mexico, who then slosh around and use these things for targeting their own civil society groups. And that stuff often gets a lot of attention and press because maybe it involves like zero-day vulnerabilities and other like sexy, exciting stuff. But like the third flavor, which is chocolate, and by far like the most overrepresented, is the like my cousin knows computers approach to cyber espionage. Like it doesn't need to be fancy. It just works, and this is because like human behavior is fucking unpatchable, right? So the same deception that worked 20 years ago will work again in different digital guises, which is what drives Shane's team nuts. But it also is a big overlap between the stuff that Eva and we are concerned with, which is at the simplest level, and for like a fucking decade, we've seen. I'm so sorry. I'll stop. We've
this
seen,
is the R-rated panel.
Yeah. Sorry, whoever is doing the moderation on this audio. We've seen. I thought I would limit myself to one, but we've seen nation-state actors using basically the same kind of spyware that abusive partners wind up using, and increasingly, like a lot of that problem space ends up in the hands of someone like Shane and other device manufacturers and operating system manufacturers whose systems are still, constantly locked in battle with those really simple technologies. And so, like, I don't know, I feel like one of the biggest problems that we face is that the entry cost is so stupid low that anyone can do it. And it ends up looking a lot like a public health problem with all of the sort of behavioral complexity that comes from something where, like, people love using their devices and they're not going to fundamentally change how they use those devices. The platforms that they use are not always designed in the most sort of like high-risk focused ways, but we don't really know who the next like clutch of activists is going to be. They have no idea who they are going to be yet, right? And yet they're going to be targeted over these platforms. People who are in a domestic situation that's going to end up in some kind of like digital spousal abuse don't necessarily know when they get their Android phone that 2 years later they're going to have like a spook sharing their bedroom, right? Fundamentally. So I don't know. It's a big problem.
It is. So to take one specific example, and I think this is either vanilla or strawberry, I lost the Neapolitan, but Shane, Google worked on exposing a very micro-targeted attack with Apple devices that you guys didn't identify who the actor was. There has been reporting since then that says this was Chinese government-linked hackers who were targeting the Muslim Uyghur minority. John, you've even worked later and said they were also targeting Tibet with this. Can you tell me?
Probably all the 5 poisons got targeted. We just know about the Uyghurs and the Tibetans.
Yeah. So tell me, how common is something like this, and how concerned should we be about these really micro-targeted attacks?
Well, I think what was really interesting about this attack, and I can't release too many more new details, we really did publish our research here, was the fact that this is one example where our team has found zero-day exploits, and for those who don't...
Can you explain what a zero-day exploit is?
Now I was about to explain exactly what that is. So a zero-day exploit is an exploit where most of the exploits out there, if you've patched your devices, you've installed all your updates, then you're actually protected because all the holes have been fixed in what's actually gone on. So really, they still work a lot because people don't update their devices, people don't patch. But what we consider like a zero-day exploit is the exploit there isn't a patch available. And that's what this was, which is one of, we treat this very seriously because there's not a lot a user can do in many cases that are against a zero-day exploit. So we have this policy, if we ever find one, and over the last 12 months, my team has actually found either 5 or 6 different zero-day exploits against different platforms. And this is with multiple different companies. And our policy is we tell the company, we help work with them to get it fixed, but we say that, there's a 7-day deadline here. We don't like expand this out that you've got months. It's like, we're going to start telling people how to protect themselves within 7 days. And the Apple case was one of these, and that's why this was such a sort of kind of attack. But again, this is the rarity, right? So it's actually somewhat the exceptional circumstance where we actually do see these zero-day exploits being used, and that's why we treat it so seriously. And I think we're having a really good effect of making it a lot harder to use these exploits. And yeah, that's really the background of what that was. And then, Project Zero did the complete analysis of the exploit, trying to understand the details of it. Because we really believe that learning more about these techniques, working out how to fix them, working out how to make sure these sort of bugs don't happen in the future is how we actually secure the entire sort of ecosystem in the world. Because this is, a very micro-targeted threat, and this is not how the biggest threat you're going to face. Like, you're going to generally be hacked because somebody's going to trick you for your password or somebody's going to trick you into installing something. But this really serious threat is one that we do have to take very seriously and something we're fighting.
John?
Yeah, so I think part of what's interesting about this case that just happened is, and part of why it's such fun drama, is how much trouble companies have with the public communication and narrative aspect of these cases, right? So Google didn't attribute, got a lot of flack for it. Later things did some form of attribution. And I feel like it's kind of an interesting space because we're putting a lot of emphasis on companies basically stopping nation states doing nation statey surveillance stuff. But those companies have like lots of different incentives, lots of different public relations incentives, different markets. And I feel like there's a bigger problem, which is the pipeline that public and policymakers have for getting like meaningful, timely information about the full scope of the threats that they or other groups face is fundamentally constricted by the different incentives of the different players. So, for example, Shane said, what was the number for nation state warnings that you guys did?
36,000 last year.
36,000, which is great, right? Holy smoke, that's a meaningful number. But it's also still challenging. Like, for example, if I was to ask Shane, 36,000, how many from each country, right? Like, how many from each threat actor? Google is limited in what they can say, and completely reasonably. But at the same time, researchers and others, we need to know that. We need to know who are the states that are the worst actors. We need to know how they're doing it. Users don't even know, right, when they get those warnings. So I think, yeah, we're in kind of a weird place. In some sense, like the other going dark problem is like information, including attribution, about threat actors and what they're really doing and where they're doing it.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to be mean. I promise not to swear, though. Nation-state targeting warnings don't work. And this has actually been one of my bitter disappointments from the last few years. I spent many years going around talking about the threat of nation-state actors and nation-state spying, and one of the things that I did was I called on companies to give users these warnings so that they know to up their game. And then it turned out that often these warnings were too vague, that they did not give the users enough information, that they just scared the pants off of the users and they didn't know what to do next. Or sometimes they would often, on occasion, they would go in exactly the opposite direction, where they would not believe the warning and believe that this is just a thing that Google does every once in a while to keep them on their toes. So I think that now is a good time for platforms to rethink the nation-state warning and think about what kind of information you can give to users that they will actually act on and that will help to protect them in the future, instead of just scaring their pants off or getting to the point where you can no longer scare their pants off and they have no pants.
I would say, it's a slight defense is the person who initially rolled out these warnings, way back in the day. Yeah, this is the big challenge. Like, how much can we communicate without revealing how we're detecting things? Because that causes, if we give up our detections, then we can't protect future users. And how to actually give changes to cause the user to make change. We have got feedback. Some users definitely do secure things. I think we have come a long way in the last 8 years, that I've been doing this, that, when I started this, nobody believed in nation-state threats. Now, we're having these sort of conversations where everybody takes it as a given. If anything, people are becoming blasé to the whole threat. But when I talk to election campaigns, when I talk to activists, people do care and believe about that there are nation-state threats out there. I do think giving a warning sometimes is a wake-up call to people, and we have seen some users, this is the mechanism of I didn't think about it, now I'm actually going to take some actions. We've measured that. But ideally, yes, we do want users to take more action. I think there is more research to go on to how to make this more the default. But I also think that we as platforms and as everyone else in this sort of industry, we can't just put all the blame on the users as well, right? It's sort of like car safety. You can't just tell everybody to drive safer. You actually have to build safer cars. And I think we are trying to work very hard to build safer operating systems, to build more security by default, to make it so the user has to do some things themselves, but we can also do a lot for the user to help secure them.
And it's interesting that you mentioned campaigns. I mean, it's organizations, not just users, that aren't able to do anything with this information. Yeah. And DHS has run into the same problem, where it's since 2016, they've been trying to get as much information as they can to campaigns, to state and local election officials. A lot of times they say, what the heck can we do with this flood of information? We don't know how to respond to that. Is there something in particular that, I guess we'll start with governments and then corporations, but that government should be doing to improve the situation?
I mean, I'll just take a freebie. I feel like it's really great to have big, thought-leading conversations about cybersecurity with a bunch of government folks. But the problem is, when they talk about cybersecurity, it's their show. And they like to think about cybersecurity issues as the great game, right? It's super exciting, and they play it with each other. And users always come second or maybe third. And the problem is, by volume, most of the bad stuff happening on the internet is happening to individuals who don't have anybody who really has their back, and who have to depend on the largesse and quality of teams like Shane's and others. But for the most part, their governments really don't have their back. Like the number of cases where Citizen Lab has gone to users and said, you've got this problem, or we worked with users, and like nothing happens, right? They have no meaningful recourse. It's remarkable. And I feel like there's an ethos here. And it's like everyone's watched videos online of people getting arrested in the US. And basically everybody who gets arrested has some version of like, wait, I know my rights. You can't, I do that, right? They have that experience. Like, I know my rights. You can't do this to me. Nobody ever says that or experiences that when they get a nation state warning, right? Nobody ever says that or experiences that when they're a victim of phishing. And I feel like that's a huge problem, and it doesn't get changed by folks in government basically continuing to view cybersecurity as them playing with other states.
Eva, is there some discrete thing that either government or industry can do to make the people you work with more secure?
I get really suspicious when somebody says, is there something the government can do? Because I spend a lot of time protecting people from governments. So I'm not here to come and tell you that governments and law enforcement are the good guys. And in fact, I'm really suspicious of giving them power. And I'm very suspicious of any remedy that involves asking the government or law enforcement to somehow be better and rescue us from ourselves. I think that what we need to start doing is really to start organizing as civil society. And there are kind of two ways to go about this. One is that the people who are speaking truth to power, the journalists and human rights lawyers and people who get out and demonstrate in the streets, need to have a very solid threat model of who's going after them and how and why. And as part of that involves the kind of work that I do and that John does over at Citizen Lab, which is writing reports about the kinds of threats that they face so that people can then do the right thing. But the other half of that is the work that Shane does, which is just making everyone's communications private and secure by default, so that you don't have to sit there and worry about what's going to happen when the government comes calling. And then finally, there's sort of the last group of people who really often get pushed to the side, and that is victims of domestic abuse. And they have the hardest threat model to deal with because you're dealing with somebody who actually has physical access to your stuff. And I think that it is really up to the companies and the platforms to start thinking about ways to deal with that particular threat model that they haven't before, because I get way more calls, I get way more complaints, and I get way more work than a single person can possibly do.
Just before we go on quick, we're taking audience questions over Twitter. If you'd like to toss one in, we still have time.
Nothing will go wrong.
Tweet them using the hashtag #postlive, and I will try to get them to some of our guests. So, John, you wanted to say something?
I was going to say, so Eva makes a really interesting point about changing threat models. And I feel like one of the things that we see a lot of in our research is device compromise, as ever is, right? But I feel like the new form of this, or at least what we're seeing, is more of a smash and grab approach, even from sophisticated actors, where they get on a device and they grab logs and then they go. And so one of the challenges there is like, man, the chat apps and so on that we use end up putting a bunch of stuff on devices. So I was super excited to read yesterday, as I'm sure some of you folks have. It looks like WhatsApp has begun to experiment with ephemerality. Did folks see this? There was like a report yesterday saying that they're starting this with group chats. I feel like that stuff is really important because the number of cases that I've looked at where threat actors have gone on and then gotten all their juice because they spent 20 minutes on a person's phone or laptop and pulled everything is huge. And it also addresses some of the issues around intimate partner surveillance, because it means that if you get a device at time A, you don't get A minus 1, 2, and 3 years worth of personal stuff. So I feel like that kind of experimentation is really good and important. But I also feel like, and I worry that there's a national security narrative right now around the importance of access to secure and encrypted communications being pulled by frankly a scary narrative around dark players who use bad things for pornography and terrorism.
And that's sort of rebounded since 2014.
really come
and
into
there's
its
a
own
Justice
recently.
Department
Child
conference on it on Friday, where both
This-
the FBI director and Attorney General are going to
Child
speak.
terrorism.
Shane,
Yeah.
you wanted to talk about this?
Yeah, I think the encryption debate never seems to die, unfortunately. 'Cause, we're against the backdoors. I think the argument here is like trying to balance the law enforcement. Like everybody thinks it's this magical solution where we can only give access to everybody's communications to the so-called good guys, but keep all the bad guys out. That we really have to, as mentioned here before, create secure platforms, because we really have to weigh the risks here. And the risks here of just having these open platforms created, even if they're created to be open or backdoored for supposedly good reasons, is just way too high to kind of run.
Why is that? Can you give the 30-second explanation? That having a backdoor to encryption
Means you don't have encryption.
means you don't have
One, it don't have encryption. Two, it means somebody has to secure that backdoor, right? So even who holds that magical backdoor key, and who do you think can keep that key for secret? And I've never heard any really solid arguments about, okay, what happens if the secret backdoor key is stolen? What happens if some insider risk at some telecommunications provider or manufacturer gets access to it? This is just creating some other new mechanism where people can have their data stolen in some massive way. And
Is this a debate inside the cybersecurity community?
I feel like it keeps coming from without, right? Every couple of years, a certain set of folks who are struggling with very legitimate law enforcement challenges are like, you know what, let's take another crack at this encryption piñata here, and maybe we've got the case that'll do it this time, right? I think within our world, it's fair to say, most of us believe, for a mix of, maybe it's ideology, maybe it's sort of historical experience or suspicion, that this is probably going to result in bad things if we go down that place. And we come at it from different reasons. Like, my argument is we have no idea what the next couple of years look like in most countries, right? If we've learned anything in the past few years. And we have no idea what happens when capricious folks with access to the ability to request that data decide to do so in ways that their underlings have trouble refusing, right? And that itself is a good argument for the importance of encryption.
So before we run out of time, I want to ask, big picture, is there any light on the horizon for things getting better for the average person or for highly targeted people in the next 5 years?
yes, I think there's light. I think there's light at the end of this tunnel. Maybe I'm the optimist in the room.
Tell us, Shane.
So one,
we're
what
gonna
we're
be all
seeing
no.
is the attackers are having to work harder, right? So
Yeah.
the sort of the dumb attacks of 3 years ago are now just being blocked. Like the rate of sort of phishing and malware and other sort of things being blocked by platforms, by systems, is increasing. So attackers are having to work harder, which is a good thing. We're seeing these bugs being killed at a faster rate, and we're also seeing that there is more things users can do. We have, things like advanced protection. If you really want to defend your Google account, you can sign up with security keys, all these other sort of mechanisms that the levers are there for somebody who really does want to get these extra protections, which, to be honest, I don't think was there 4 or 5 years ago, that there was not as much you should do. But I think I want people to walk away not thinking that it's all hopeless, there's nothing you can do, you're going to get hacked, so give up. Where what we really do see is that if you do take some protections and the platforms work at it, you trust the platforms that are doing a good job here, then your risks run a lot. You're a lot more secure, and you actually have pretty good odds. Of course, there's the bolt out of the blue, 0-day, super targeted stuff that might hit you the same way getting hit by lightning does in real world. But in the real world, you should probably be worried about getting fit, not having a heart attack, not about lightning strikes. You should also be more worried about the basic stuff. And I think that overall security level is increasing.
Eva, did you want to?
Sure. So I'm going to take a dissenting view. Surprise. Yes, to some extent, some of our accounts and some of our platforms are becoming safer, and we have more options, and that is great. But our attack surface is also expanding exponentially with every passing year. We are filling our homes and our offices with microphones and cameras that are extremely insecure. And that are often manufactured by companies that don't have security and privacy as a particularly high value. and that certainly don't think about nation-state level APTs in their threat model, and they don't think about law enforcement. For example, there is a great deal of argument about the installation of Ring doorbells in neighborhoods and sort of their partnership with local law enforcement. And Amazon continues to insist that this actually cuts down on crime, whereas the research seems to indicate that filling your neighborhood with cameras that everybody can see does not actually cut down on crime very much. It just increases the amount of surveillance that you have.
I just, real quick, before we run out of time here, I don't want to go through a panel without talking about election security. Big picture, how confident should we be, do you guys think, from a private sector perspective about the 2020 contest?
Ooh. My observation is every time we have looked at elections outside of the US in the past couple of years, so every time we've scratched, we've found all kinds of players, domestic and foreign, mucking around in those elections. I cannot think of an election that's happened in the past few years where there hasn't been experimentation and muckery. And the biggest thing that bugs me
You said
is
muckery, just to be clear.
The biggest thing that freaks me out is that so many of our analogies and the way that we're talking are still, by the virtue of the 2016 narrative and access, it's just pulling our intuitions back towards that. And I think that the problem space just looks really different. And I'm not at all convinced that we've got a good handle on it right now.
Guys, quick.
I wouldn't say we've got a handle on it. I would say that unlike 2016, and I went through the 2016 things, that there is a lot more people working this problem. There are a lot more people taking this more seriously. The government's taking it more seriously, industry, people are working together, and it is like the top priority of everyone. So, watch this space to see how it plays out. But if anything does happen, it's not going to be due to a lack of effort by the platforms or anyone else, because I think people are taking these threats seriously.
That's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone. Please hold on for our final segment.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Nakashima. I'm a national security reporter for the Washington Post, and we're very fortunate to have here today Sujit Raman, the Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice, and he leads on cyber issues for the department and chairs the Attorney General's Cyber Task Force. So Sujit and I are going to have a very wide-ranging, interesting conversation on one of the key issues facing us today, and that's the challenge of encryption, what the department and FBI sometimes calls going dark. So Sujit, set the table for us by describing briefly what role digital evidence plays for us today, plays for you in your criminal and national security investigations. How crucial is it, and how do you obtain it?
Well, thank you, Ellen, and thank you for having me today. Digital evidence is critical. If you're in the business of trying to enforce a rule of law system, the way that you prove cases in court is through evidence. And the reality is, the world we live in today, everything is digital. Your business records are digital, your phone records are digital, often your communications themselves are digital if you're talking on the phone or via an application. So for us to build cases, we need to have access to electronic evidence and digital evidence. Of course, everything we do is bounded by law. So we want to make sure that we, in law enforcement, when we seek evidence, we're doing it in a lawful way. Part of the difficulties that we're facing now is that the way technology has developed, and obviously technology has incredibly positive benefits. Encryption is something that we are in support of. Mm-hmm. If you're in the business of protecting sensitive information, including government information, you want to make sure it's secure. On the other hand, those very same technologies that protect information also make it increasingly difficult for us to gain access to it, even with court authorization. And I think that's, in a nutshell, encapsulates the going dark problem.
So give us a sense, how severe a problem is it, and about roughly what percentage of your cases, pick up, category, criminal, drugs, and what percentage of those cases does encrypted evidence pose a challenge for you?
I think it's difficult to quantify because it really depends on the nature of the case, the type of investigation. What I can tell you is that when it comes to, for example, data in motion, so communications, this is publicly known, many apps are end-to-end encrypted. And so we cannot gain access, even with a court order, to those communications. And so if people are communicating, let's say by FaceTime or by iMessage, even if we go to a judge and fulfill all of the very rigorous requirements to seek a wiretap under federal law, when we go try to serve the order, the companies simply cannot execute because they've designed their systems in a way that doesn't allow the interception. And so that creates tremendous obstacles for us when we've satisfied all the legal obligations
Right.
to access that evidence.
So is it more than 50% now of your drug cases, would you say? Or
So like I said, it really depends
Yeah.
on the nature of the case. What I can say, once WhatsApp went end-to-end encrypted, this is a few years ago, the number of DEA wires fell precipitously. I won't get into specific numbers, but I can tell you that it was a massive drop because DEA investigators who were often running these wiretap investigations, and for those of you who know, when we're doing transnational organized narcotics cases, you need to be up on wires because that's how the drug dealers typically are communicating, the traffickers. Those numbers fell precipitously once WhatsApp, which is obviously a very popular encrypted app, went end-to-end encrypted. So it's had a material impact on our ability to undertake our investigations.
Well, so let's move into another area where we might actually see the impact of this. This past weekend, the New York Times published a major investigation on child abuse and exploitation online. The report was unequivocal. Online child abuse is rampant with no signs of stopping, and technology both supports and protects abusers. Encryption specifically has been a major roadblock for law enforcement. And in fact, Facebook recently, as you know, announced it was going to put strong encryption, end-to-end encryption on Messenger. So how will that affect your child abuse investigations?
So it will have a tremendous impact. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Alan, because that is one area where we do have statistics and very clear statistics. Last year, around 18 million, more than 18 million tips, cyber tips, were reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So these are essentially tips that the technology providers send to NCMEC, which is a non-governmental organization, showing evidence of child sexual abuse on their platform. So 18 million. I mean, think about that number. If Facebook end-to-end encrypts all of its platforms, including Facebook Messenger and Instagram, which the company has publicly said it will do, the estimation is that millions of those tips will go dark. And so, again, to put flesh on the bone, as I said last year, about 18 million tips. Over 90% of those tips were reported by Facebook, right? So the company actually, under the current status quo, is doing pretty good work in trying to identify child exploitative material that's being traded on this platform.
And it's supposed to report it to this non-governmental organization so that that organization can then
refer it to law enforcement or take appropriate action. So once NCMEC gets the tip, it gives it to state and local law enforcement or to federal law enforcement. We then follow up and try to arrest the individual. The key point here is that of those, as I said, 18 million, over 90% last year were provided by Facebook. If Facebook goes end-to-end encrypted, essentially 70-75% of those 16 million tips will go dark. So that is a very practical application of how not having visibility into what's happening on these platforms will have a material impact on public safety. And these are children, right? This is child sexual abuse that we're talking about. And as the New York Times article said, this is widespread. You know, the stuff that's happening on the internet now is really pretty scary.
So these companies, you know, Facebook, Apple, they've talked about the encryption that they're putting on their devices and on their platforms as a way to, you know, enhance the privacy and security of their users, of everyone. And if, you know, in so doing, it affects, it helps criminals. Well, that's a little the price we pay for living in a free society. How have, you know, the Justice Department, the FBI, in the last 3 years or so, have tried to have a public conversation about this debate? They've asked these companies to voluntarily try to work with them to come up with solutions to the problem. Bill Barr, the Attorney General, in July at Fordham University, sort of repeated that call, and he said that these companies have the capability, the ingenuity to come up with technical solutions. Where do you stand on that? Have we made, you know, any headway in that debate and that ongoing conversation with the tech companies?
So it's been difficult. You know, candidly, we're not looking to demonize the tech companies. We want to foster innovation. You know, these are the same companies that have created driverless cars, they've created drones, they've created wearable tech. I mean, these are the most innovative companies in the world. I think the question that we have, or the call that we'd like to make to tech, is work with us. Try to find ways to protect security, protect privacy, while also factoring in that very important component of public safety. Because I think often in the conversation, that's what's forgotten. And there are, as I said, very real impacts on real people when we're not able to have visibility into what's going on in these networks. So when it comes to the companies, you know, we've been reaching out. We've made efforts. The Attorney General spoke. The Director of the FBI has made multiple overtures. I wish the companies would do more, and that's something we're working on. But we're not looking to demonize the companies. We hope that they work with us. But on the other hand, we have an obligation to the American public to call a spade a spade. And so we're not we're not going to go away either, because this is a real public safety problem.
Are you considering legislation to require companies to build in lawful access to their platforms?
So what I'd say is that we're, at least now, and I think this is an administration-wide position, are actively engaging with the public to raise awareness of the lawful access problem, the warrant-proof encryption problem. I think you'll see various parts of the government reaching out. Obviously, you've got the Department of Justice, you've got the FBI. I think the Commerce Department will be reaching out to industry shortly to talk about the need to solve and find solutions, find improvements to this problem. The Department of Homeland Security which has a very important cybersecurity mission, but also a very significant law enforcement mission as well. I think you'll see them publicly reaching out and trying to raise awareness of this issue. So we're at a point now where I think we're trying to make sure that the public is aware of the costs and benefits of what's going on here, because a lot of the decisions are being made by corporate executives for their own business purposes. But that has tremendous impacts on our public safety and our broader public policy. So that broader political conversation needs to take place. The only other thing I'd say, you mentioned legislation, there are other rule of law nations that have made legislative moves in this area. Last December, Australia, obviously a rule of law partner of ours, enacted legislation in this context. They're still implementing it. They're still figuring out exactly what it looks like. But
Britain also?
And Britain a couple of years ago passed the IPA, the Investigative Powers Act, which has certain provisions relating to providing decrypted information. So we run the risk in America of falling behind, actually, because our partners, our democratic rule of law partners, are starting to examine this issue because they understand that it's a very complex set of factors that we need to be taking into account.
Okay, but if those, do those laws apply to US companies like Facebook and Apple and Google?
So, I mean, I think you'd have to ask the Australians and the British about that. My sense is that they would have similar jurisdictional principles that we do. So in other words, if American companies are doing business in these countries, they subject themselves to the laws of those countries. Exactly what the mechanics are, I think it just depends. My understanding of the Australian legislation is that it's still in a pretty early stage of implementation.
Okay, so let's move on to another separate but related issue that grows out of this time actual legislation that Congress passed. What was it, a year ago now?
About a year, March of 18.
The Cloud Act.
Yep.
And that was to get at an issue of access to data, but not necessarily encrypted data. Can you briefly describe what the Cloud Act is and what it does?
So the Cloud Act was a major legislative accomplishment last year. It was bipartisan. Industry was very supportive because many companies found themselves in an awkward position. They'd receive legal process from, say, the United Kingdom, but they would be barred from producing data to the British government because American law had essentially a blocking function, that you couldn't produce data to a foreign government because under US domestic law, those are privacy protections. You can't just produce data to anyone who asks. And so the companies found themselves in a difficult position, a conflict of law position, where they were under a legal obligation to produce data to, say, the United Kingdom, but they were forbidden by US law to produce that information. So the companies actually came to us and said, look, we're in a really tough spot here. Can you please help us? Now, we were hearing it at the Justice Department from our partners in the UK, who were saying, look, we're trying to investigate a murder that took place in London. The perpetrator is British. The victim is British. Everything happened in Britain. but the guy's using a Gmail account. And so the evidence is being held by a US-based service provider. We can't do our jobs because the evidence is held outside the UK, and your law, American law, forbids Google from producing in response. So there were actually very interesting dynamics at play. We had foreign partners asking for help. We had industry asking for help. We had our own motivations. You know, we don't want murderers running around the streets of London. Less of a concern for us, but still a significant one. And so everyone came together and in March of last year enacted the Cloud Act, which essentially allows for rule of law partners that we engage in bilateral executive agreements with to serve US-based service providers directly with legal process. So now instead of having to go through the mutual legal assistance process, a treaty-based process, which can take a while, it can take a couple of years, particularly with electronic evidence cases, once these agreements come into place, say the UK can serve Google directly and receive data directly. But again,
so is that happening now, or is this agreement in place between the US and UK? Or
so there is not any agreements in place
we're
yet.
About to get one, right?
What I can say is the US and the UK have been working very hard to move towards finalizing an agreement.
We hear that might even be this week.
So I'm not in a position to make any announcements today. Thank you, Ellen, for asking. But I can say, look, this has been a priority. This has been a priority for us, and I expect there to be movement promptly.
Perhaps even announcements.
It's possible.
Okay. Will this apply? Will this sort of bilateral agreement apply to countries like Russia and China?
So, I mean, no. The straightforward answer is no, because under the statute, and this was part of the negotiations. You know, when we were trying to get this legislation enacted in Congress, we had very positive conversations with the civil rights community, civil society community, and obviously with congressional staff as well, to make it clear that this direct exchange of data should only occur with rule of law countries that protect privacy, that honor civil liberties, and have protections in place. And so if you look at the law, there's actually a catalog of factors that the Attorney General has to certify that country X meets these standards before he can engage in one of these bilateral executive agreements. So the short answer is totalitarian countries have no business entering into these agreements, and we will not engage in negotiations with them.
Great, and time has flown by so quickly. We have only a few seconds left. Do you have any other announcements to make, maybe about encryption going dark, what the department is about to do this week? Any plans?
Yeah, so on Friday, we're hosting a public summit at Department of Justice headquarters, although we'll also be live streaming it, so for those of you who can't make it, on lawful access, on the question of warrant-proof encryption and the impact it has, particularly on child exploitation cases. Ellen, to get to your question at the outset. So we anticipate a very high-profile event. The Attorney General will be there, the FBI Director will speak, and we have two very special guests from around the world.
Which countries?
The British Home Secretary, Ms. Patel, will be there, and the Australian Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton. So trying to send a message that rule of law countries will stand together on this issue, that when it comes to access to information, we're united on making sure that we protect privacy, that we protect civil liberties, but that we also keep public safety imperatives in mind as well.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much, Sujit, for that, and let's thank him and move on to our final segment. Hello again, everyone. Ellen Nakashima with the Washington Post National Security Reporter. And for the last conversation of the morning, we are so proud and honored to have Bill Evanina, the top U.S. counterintelligence official and director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, the United States, as well as David Hickton, the first U.S. attorney to obtain an indictment of Chinese military spies for economic espionage, or as Bill likes to call him, the OG of Chinese espionage cases, and the founder of the University of Pittsburgh Institute for Law, Policy, and Security. So our conversation today is going to focus on the top counterintelligence priority for the country, is China. And we often hear of the challenge of a rising China. It's an indispensable trading partner, and at the same time, it's a rival on the global stage. So China has a complicated relationship with the United States, especially when it comes to technological advancement and global market dominance. So Bill, as the head of U.S. counterintelligence, you have a unique vantage point. When it comes to China, where is the U.S. most vulnerable? Is it from IP theft or economic espionage? Is it the race to dominate advanced technologies? Is this a Chinese spy agencies versus US spy agency, or is it a Chinese spy agencies versus the US private sector and academia? How do you frame the challenge?
So I will choose E in the answer, all of the above. And I think when you look at it from a strategic perspective of the US government and private sector, we have to look at all of those vectors individually, but as a group of one. And I think it's important for our audience to understand that geopolitically and militarily, economically, China is all of one, right? So in America, we have had the opportunity to grow up in a society where we have clear bifurcation between the government, the private sector, and the criminal element. And that's not the case in the People's Republic of China or in Russia or Iran. So it's an unfair playing field, and they utilize all those resources as one to combat us. And I think for this conversation, the important part of answer D was that right now our struggle is that it's an intelligence services battle against our private industry. And that's not the way we do business. So we're trying to combat that and allow and alleviate the threat by integrating the private sector as part of the battle. And that's our biggest challenge right now.
Yeah. Well, and Dave, as I mentioned, you led the case against hackers working for the People's Liberation Army of China, but that's just one of the many precedent-setting cases you've spearheaded in cyberspace. How many, but in some sense, how many of them have actually wound up in prison? Once in a while, you get lucky and some defendant travels to a country with an extradition treaty and gets picked up and sent over here. But Chinese hackers are not likely to do that. So how do we hold these malign Chinese actors in cyberspace accountable?
Well, you're correct, but I think that the case we brought in 2014 led to the agreement between President Obama and President Xi, which is an even greater result, which everybody agrees reduced intellectual property theft down until virtually the election of 2016. But you're making a very good point that we don't have an extradition treaty, and this is one of the challenges of the borderless nature of cybercrime. I argue that unmasking cyber criminals has virtue in and of itself, because the principal currency of cyber criminals is their anonymity. And if you unmask them and declare that they did it, that's the first step. By the time I left the government, I was trying to expand the forums for adjudicating these cases beyond criminal investigations into the World Trade Organization, Commerce, and Treasury. And my belief is that we need to hold foreign actors to the same standard we would hold American citizens, so that if they steal from our industry, particularly intellectual property, they ought not participate in our markets.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to jump on that because
Sure.
I believe that that was a seminal moment in our government's ability to combat theft of IP and trade secrets, because it was turned out to be a marketing endeavor where we were able to educate and inform the American public, as well as the entire government writ large, of an intelligence services, in this case, the People's Liberation Army, theft of our business and our economic and ingenuity and know-how for their military purposes. And I think that was a watershed moment that we kept always in the government, but this was the first time we were able to shed light on that theft.
And one of the key achievements in that, Dave, was your ability to get these private sector companies who traditionally, historically, do not like to come forward and admit that they've been hacked or compromised and have their names out there publicly for reputation, harms their reputation. You got them to actually agree to be public about it, have their names mentioned in the indictment. Talk about that. How did you get them to come forward?
Right.
Why
I
is
was
that
an
so
unusual
significant?
United States attorney because I hadn't served in the Department of Justice, and I had represented many of these people and known many of them since childhood. But I spent most of my time trying to make sure that we could not only bring the case, but tell the story by putting a picture of the defendants, which we did at the back of the indictment, that iconic picture that came off a wanted poster, which showed the public who did it, and also departing from what would have been the norm, which is company A, B, C, D, E, but also putting a picture of who the victims are. And then when we announced the case, I described how this affected real people, because it led U.S. Steel, the United Steelworkers, Alcoa, Westinghouse, and how this led to factory closings and lost jobs, and why we needed to care about this.
So Bill, expand on that. That was like 2014, was it? And now here we are 5 years later. it's not just steel and paint secrets that the Chinese are after. They're moving into biopharma and genetics. Can you talk a little bit about?
So publicly, we talk about the span of influence and requirements that I would say the Ministry of State Security works with the Communist Party that developed to come here and actually steal innovation. And it goes from biopharma to green energy, to leading technology, to future markets, to gas, oil, shale, clean energy. And we saw a few years ago with the Monsanto case, stealing hybrid grains and sand because they have to feed 1.4 billion people. So they would rather not create their own research and development arm where they can come over here to the West and take it. And they go first to market. Their patent program is quicker, more effective than ours, and they immediately get gain of a local or international market at 30 cents on the dollar.
Right. This idea of them stealing or working with genetic mapping companies in the U.S. Tell me about. I hadn't heard about that. What's going on there? That sounds.
So it's complicated. So not only do they use their intelligence arms and their non-traditional collectors to steal our intellectual property, trade secrets. In the case recently with utilization of Duke and Yale's capability for genome mapping, sometimes we actually engage with them and do great collaborative work with their research and development and their academic work, and they take it anyway. So it's a not-winning environment. But they took that technology on genome and DNA, and they used it to imprison over 1 million Uyghurs. Right? So even great technology that we utilize for great purposes sometimes is used nefariously by intelligence services of rogue nations.
So this was done by the MSS, which is sort of their major intelligence service. They took this through legitimate, lawful research partnerships.
Some lawful, some unwitting, and some illegal, right? And I think that's the idea that they utilize a whole-of-country approach to the theft of our intellectual property trade secrets. They'll use collaborative mindsets in academia, joint ventures, private equity, venture capital to be able to utilize all tools, whole society approach to obtaining our secrets.
Talk a little bit, both of you, I guess, about the academic approach that the Chinese are making. This issue now with the Chinese trying to, or using, gaining access to universities and university secrets, but also maybe trying to influence academics or Chinese students and researchers there. How much of a challenge or threat really is it? And what is the government's role here to do anything about it?
Well, in my view, it's a huge threat. Look, the good news is we are still the cradle of innovation and the best academic country in the world. Everybody wants to send their kids to school here. And lost in the shadow of the PLA case, which I did in 2014, was in 2015 I exposed a network of gunmen who were fictitious test takers or fraudulent test takers who existed in this country who were taking the SAT and the GRE for students in China. And somehow they were getting passports, they would get admission to our colleges, and then they would get a student visa and then go home after they were educated here. And this was an organized network, and it at the least deprived American students who might have been paying taxes for some of these state-related colleges space in those universities. There's an invasion of our research. There have been cases that have done there. So I believe this is a real threat. I believe what the government should do about it is the same we do with intellectual property. It seems to me that if we're going to have digital space, and we are the #1 economy, and we are the #1 research and development location in the world, American citizens should be treated equally with citizens around the world. And nation-state intrusions should be treated as a real and present threat. So I cheer the expansion of this initiative.
I'll double down on the threat. We believe it's critical up there next to 5G with moving forward. But what we're doing about it. So this past year, working under the leadership of Senator Burr and Senator Warner, a bipartisan effort in Congress.
The chairman and vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Great. We utilized in my office the FBI and DHS, and we met personally with over 150 university and college presidents to talk about the threat, what it's like. We gave them a one-day classified reading so they could understand the intention of these foreign leaders, as well as here's the threat, here's how it's manifested, and here's the amount of investigations that are being done by the FBI. And let's work together to find a solution that is not only effective and efficient for you as universities and colleges, but also doesn't, I would say, perform the effort of any type of racism because the argument has been this is a racist issue, and the Chinese intelligence services have been pushing that envelope very, very effectively here in the U.S., but it's not. When you look at the amount of investigations the FBI has, which is over 900, 95% of them are from the People's Republic of China.
Over 900 espionage or counter-espionage investigations?
Yep, with respect to economic espionage.
Oh, economic espionage, right. But in fact, there have been a few cases where the department has had to drop the case, or the case got thrown out, for lack of evidence. And these were cases of, I believe, economic espionage against Chinese American, often academics or researchers at universities, which has led to criticism that the Justice Department is overreaching and is sort of seeing a Chinese threat amongst the Chinese American community here that doesn't really exist.
Well, I'm in academia now, and I think that's a valid concern. And we still, in our institutions of higher education, aspire to have a worldwide student body, and the educational opportunity in a diverse population is valued. So I think we have to be real careful to get that point right.
And I will double down on the importance of understanding the threat versus actually who's committing the threat. But recently the FBI and DOJ charged and indicted an American citizen in a university campus for spying for the Chinese intelligence services. So it's not about the facilitating AI and ML in the billions of dollars is dramatic. What they do have also, which is an unfair playing advantage, is all the theft of everyone's PII they've stolen, not only here in America, around the world. That theft of PII helps facilitate.
That's personally identifiable information.
That's correct, and that allows them to use that data sets, hundreds of thousands of petabytes of data. Just recently, the Anthem healthcare was 78 million Americans had their healthcare records. They use that in the AI to be able to promulgate advanced analytics. So the more data they steal from us, from PII, whether travel records, they use that to facilitate testing of their AI platforms.
Like the OPM breach as well, right?
21 million Americans' records.
All went into big databases over which the Chinese run their AI algorithms.
Right. Some of the current estimates is that more than 50% of the American adults have had all of their PII stolen by the People's Republic of China.
Wow, it's half of us here. Dave, did you?
Well, I mean, the current denigration of facts and science is a threat to us. The retreat on investment in scientific research is a threat to us. But we in Pittsburgh have been the home of a lot of great advances, whether it's manufacturing, medical, and technology. And those have all been sponsored by partnership between the government, the academic community, and private industry. And we need to continue that so that we can make Pittsburgh or Detroit or Philadelphia the envy of Shanghai instead of the other way around.
Well, in fact, China has one advantage in this sense, in that they are much more of a command and control economy, and it's the government, can basically order companies and universities to do its bidding. Here, we have a much more free market system, and we try to keep independence from that market. But is there more of a need, do you think, for the government to sort of maybe direct areas of research funded, give incentives so that we're not left as, caught, in the background?
I mean, perhaps, but even when the government sponsors it or directs it, it's still driven by the scientist. I'd like to really address the premise of your question, though. Some think that the initiative, particularly the work I did, was anti-China, and it was exactly the opposite. I personally believe that China is the linchpin of developing norms and laws in the emerging world of digital space, because they are the #2 economy in the world. And at some point, they're going to appreciate that they have as much to lose as the #1 economy has to lose. I mean, there's the old saw in law enforcement from Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is there. If you look at the threat vectors, they're all coming at the United States because we have things to lose. They can barely turn the lights on in North Korea and Russia. But China is not like that. So applying law to digital space was the essence of my mission in my former job. And I think if we do that correctly, it becomes part of a strategy as opposed to a tactic to make China our partner.
And that was the strategy for years, of engagement, right, with between the U.S. and China to open our markets to them so that they would maybe become more like us, want to be part of the free market and abide by the rules then of the WTO, and they haven't followed those. They aren't following the same norms in cyberspace about respecting free and open internet. So how likely is it that we will be able to get China to become more like a rule of law nation and abide by Western norms and traditions?
Well, I can't predict the end of that, but I can say that any effort like this requires persistence and it's going to take time. The one thing I think has been successful is if you just look at China writ large, they largely have become more Western. Their young people are more Western. Okay. And I think that our engagement strategy has worked. It just requires continuous effort.
So I will differ with my partner on this one a little bit. I think under the leadership of Xi Jinping, they have become the most amazing surveillance state we've seen in decades. And the social score they have and the ability to photograph and their facial recognition of every second of everybody's life over there is really, and you see what's going on in Hong Kong right now, you see the power. Secondly, I think with any change that we just talked about has to come the agreement of ceasing the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. If we're somewhere in the middle of 400 to 600 billion a year in economic loss due to their theft, that's about $4,000 per American family after taxes. So we have to be able to stem that tide of their theft. If we can't, then I don't know how we can get to a place where we get back to the diplomacy of hope.
What will stem that? I mean, sanctions? There was a point at which the Obama administration was about to impose economic sanctions for economic espionage in China.
I think it's going to take a multifaceted, multiple levers to be able to do that, to include policy from the White House, legislation from Congress, and I think a change of mindset in the American people to understand the damage and the value add or value subtracted from this effort. And I think that's going to be literally a whole country approach to stem the tide.
I don't really disagree with what Bill said, but I think that we do need sanctions, and I think that we have to really appreciate that the current trade war has impacted us negatively. We have divided our assets in the current trade war as opposed to multiply them by combining application of the rule of law with selling below cost within our markets. When we could multiply that, the conversation, we have halved it, in my view.
Okay. I want to get to a question from the audience, but first I wanted to get to the issue of Huawei, the Chinese telecom equipment maker that is a big issue for the U.S. government and in Europe too, especially as we're moving into 5G super fast, super advanced telecom networks. The U.S. government has been pressing allies in Europe, especially, to bar Huawei from their 5G networks, and with mixed, results or success. The argument there is that allowing Huawei into your networks will open a door for either, Chinese surveillance or cyber attacks that could disrupt the network at a critical moment. But Sue Gordon, who is the recent Deputy Director of National Intelligence, you know well, Bill, has publicly argued that we have to take a pragmatic view that even if we don't have Huawei in our 5G here, there will be other countries around the world that do have Huawei in their networks, and we interconnect with those networks. So you've got to manage risk and presume a dirty network. What do you think, Bill? Is she right?
Well, in my space, whether she's right or not, I hate to even think about having to presume a dirty network. In the world I live in counterintelligence, I think that is the beginning of the end. I think from a practical standpoint, she might be right, but I think our efforts in the intelligence community, in the counterintelligence writ large, is to not have that dirty network. And I think we've been able to prove around the globe the nefarious activity of Huawei and what they're capable of doing now, never mind when we have a 5G platform. I would also say that Huawei, to me, in my position, is not the problem. It's the Communist Party of China. So if Huawei goes away, there's another company that's going to facilitate that role of the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping's effort to be the global supplier of telecommunications. And I think that is the threat we face, not necessarily a company of Huawei.
I agree completely. One of the last cases I worked on ultimately led to the indictment of the so-called Boyacep group, which was Advanced Persistent Threat Group 3. When the case was originally presented to me, it was enforcement of the Obama-Xi agreement. It later developed to be a global positioning satellite case, so think Google Maps, think bombs, drones, and then someone talked to me about precision agriculture, which I didn't know about. And then it later became written up as the spy arm of Huawei. So the Huawei conversation sounds like a 5G conversation that just emerged, but the Huawei conversation's been going on for some time. And I agree that they will go away until we, and someone else will replace them, until we address with China what is going to be our understanding. And I'm confident we can get there. It's just going to be very hard.
Okay, great. So I have a question from the audience about the law enforcement tool of indictments. The person asks, have the indictments against Chinese hackers done any good? I mean, I think, Dave, you mentioned that at one point this all kind of led to the Obama-Xi agreement, the pledge not to conduct economic espionage in cyberspace, which worked, it seemed, for about a year or so, but then where the PLA started tailing off on its hacking, the MSS picked up. So, now that agreement didn't seem to really be meaningful. So what do you think?
I think it's an expectation issue. No one would suggest for a minute that the FBI, which started investigating bank robberies, is useless because we've never solved bank robbery. Our expectation in law enforcement is to reduce, not eliminate crime. I think it was a very important start. I would be the first to admit it was extremely controversial, and we did not bring them to Pittsburgh. I may be the only one left who believes they're ultimately going to be tried in Pittsburgh. But it did lead to the Obama-Xi agreement, and that was something no one thought of at the time. And so imagine, do we give them 3 squares and a roof over their head for 10 years, or do the presidents of China and Russia get together and reach an agreement, which everybody agrees for a period of time reduced intellectual property theft down to 0?
They also came and Xi came over and did the agreement in part because of, I think, the threat of economic sanctions, which,
Correct.
Washington Post reported were about to happen, and that I think that combined with the indictments may have pushed them to come and make the agreement.
Well, 2 things. Number one, I think the agreement with Xi is forefront of the conversation, and I agree that he, as president, agreed to stop the economic espionage from a cyber perspective. It did not stop it from a human perspective, the insider threat. So that increased dramatically. So they never stopped stealing, and they did make the transition from the PLA to the MSS in a more human-based effort. Secondly, I think with the indictments are critical, because I spend a lot of time with our partners, especially in the Five Eyes. The recent 2 Huawei indictments have been earth-shattering, I think, in terms of getting the facts out by DOJ of what the indictments are, what they mean for the private sector industry. So when I go to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Great Britain, they look at these indictments very carefully and see how that manifests in their country. So as much as we are exposing the People's Republic of China for their nefarious activity, there is positive impact with our partners around the globe about that same activity in their country.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have right now, but let's thank Bill and Dave for a wonderful conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great.